In 1931, in a modest home in Virginia Beach, something extraordinary began that would transform how thousands of people understood the connection between meditation, the Bible, and human consciousness. Edgar Cayce agreed to help a group of people grow spiritually, and over 11 years, they applied and compiled 24 lessons that became A Search for God, Books 1 and 2. But this wasn't just another spiritual study group. What emerged from these sessions would reveal one of the most profound secrets ever documented about meditation, that it was the hidden key to understanding biblical mysteries and unlocking extraordinary human potential. Edgar Cayce, 1877 to 1945, has been called the sleeping prophet, the father of holistic medicine, and the most documented psychic of the 20th century. For more than 40 years of his adult life, Cayce gave psychic readings to thousands of seekers while in an unconscious state. But among his over 14,000 documented readings, perhaps none were more revolutionary than those dealing with meditation and its connection to spiritual development. The meeting was called because the members wanted a new challenge. For several months they had been studying the great religious traditions of the world. Now they wanted to work more directly with Cayce's psychic information. Some wanted to become more spiritual, others to know if they, like Edgar Cayce, could develop psychic abilities. A few others desired to be of service to a troubled world. What happened next would change everything we thought we knew about meditation's role in human spiritual evolution. In the first psychic reading to the group, Cayce offered a promise. If they were sincere in their desire and commitment, they could give light to the waiting world. But to achieve this, they would need to master something that had been hidden in plain sight for centuries, the practice of meditation, as revealed through biblical principles. The group members made a covenant with one another and promised to follow certain disciplines to enhance their work together. They would meditate every morning in their own homes, conscious of the fact that the other group members were meditating at the same time. This wasn't coincidence. Through his readings, Cayce revealed that meditation was far more than relaxation or stress relief. It was the fundamental technology for accessing what he called Christ consciousness and understanding the deeper meanings hidden within biblical texts. Edgar Cayce's views on meditation, based on his readings and insights, provided 3 keys to successful meditation: sincerity in one's relationship with God, enthusiasm for seeking God through studying the Bible and examining spiritual people, and perseverance in continual daily meditation efforts. But here's where Cayce's revelations became truly extraordinary. He described how meditation can stimulate and purify the endocrine glands and spiritual centers of the body, allowing spiritual energy and forces to flow and cleanse the mind and body. This wasn't just metaphysical theory. Cayce provided precise anatomical explanations of how meditation worked within the human body. The Cayce readings tell us that when consciousness has been raised within us through meditation, it is also raised in others as we pray for them. Ideally, this consciousness of the Christ should be raised through all 7 spiritual centers, culminating in the center of one's forehead, the pituitary center, with a burst of light. What made this even more remarkable was Cayce's revelation that these spiritual centers corresponded directly to biblical symbols and stories. The 7 churches mentioned in Revelation weren't just historical congregations. They were maps of the spiritual anatomy that could be activated through proper meditation practice. The Edgar Cayce readings repeatedly emphasized the importance of meditation as an integral ingredient for personal transformation. In fact, they suggested that information on meditation be added to the 24 lessons that comprise A Search for God. During World War II, when families across America were desperate for guidance and hope, the power of these meditation practices became even more evident. During the war years, when many frantic parents contacted him searching for the whereabouts and safety of their sons in service, Mr. Cayce gave up to 10 readings a day, even though his own health readings advised him to give no more than 2 readings per day. The readings revealed that meditation wasn't just personal practice, but could create spiritual connections that transcended physical limitations. This aligned with Cayce's understanding of how biblical figures like Jesus maintained their connection to divine consciousness. Too much stress has been placed upon the desirability of escaping from physical existence. Instead, Cayce taught that meditation was about fully inhabiting our spiritual potential while in physical form, exactly as the great spiritual figures of the Bible had done. The practical instructions Cayce provided were surprisingly accessible, yet profoundly transformative. We must find that which to our consciousness is the best way of purifying body and mind before attempting to enter into meditation. In raising the image of that through which we are seeking to know the will of the creative force, actual creation takes place within us. This wasn't just spiritual philosophy, but precise instruction for accessing what Cayce called the creative force, the same power that biblical figures accessed through their spiritual practices. When we have found a way to cleanse our bodies so that which is to be raised finds its full measure of expression within, we can readily understand how healing of every nature may be disseminated by thought. The study group that worked with Cayce discovered this wasn't theoretical but practical reality. Through consistent meditation practice, following Cayce's guidance, members began experiencing the same types of spiritual awareness described in biblical accounts. The affirmations and basic discourses under each chapter heading came from general readings given by Edgar Cayce. Questions were asked, and experiences during meditation explained in subsequent readings for 12 people. To these individuals, it brought hope, peace, a better understanding of their fellow human beings, and an inner joy in a greater awareness of attunement with the Creator. But Cayce's most revolutionary insight was showing how meditation techniques were actually encoded within familiar Bible verses. Take the instruction, "Be still and know that I am God," from Psalms 46:10. Most people read this as simple advice to be quiet and trust God. But Cayce revealed the precise meditation instructions hidden within these words. Be still referred to specific techniques for achieving what the masters call the silence within. Know is not intellectual understanding, but direct spiritual experience through activated consciousness. I am God is the recognition that the creative force lives within every soul. This pattern repeated throughout biblical texts. Cayce showed that Jesus' parables weren't just moral stories, but sophisticated meditation instructions. The Sermon on the Mount contained detailed guidance for achieving higher states of consciousness. The book of Revelation described what happens when all spiritual centers in the body are fully activated through advanced meditation practice. Prayer is mentioned 1,743 times throughout the Edgar Cayce readings. The 262 series given to the original study group references the subject in over 65 of the 131 sessions recorded over 11 years. That's nearly half of those readings. But prayer and meditation weren't separate practices in Cayce's system. They were complementary aspects of the same spiritual technology. Prayer is more than attuning one's mind to the spiritual. It is a cooperative effort to connect body and mind with the goal of allowing the soul to communicate with the divine. It is a state of becoming, of allowing the self to step aside and beckon forth the creative forces. The results achieved by the original study group were documented and verified. The manuscript resulted from the study and work of the original study group number 1 of the Association for Research and Enlightenment, Incorporated, Virginia Beach, Virginia. It was written not by one person, but by many individuals. What emerged wasn't just personal transformation, but a systematic approach to spiritual development that could be replicated by anyone willing to dedicate themselves to the practice. Love, God, is that dynamic force that brings into manifestation all things. It is the healing force, the cleansing force, and the force that blesses everything we touch. With our hearts filled with love, we will see only goodness and purity in everybody and in everything. This love wasn't just emotion, but what Cayce called the Christ consciousness, a state of awareness that could be cultivated through proper meditation practice and expressed through daily life. The scientific implications of Cayce's teachings about meditation and spiritual centers are now being validated by modern research. Edgar Cayce is known for his trance-like states where he aligned his mind with the universal consciousness. He channeled insights offering practical help and advice to answer questions asked by people from across the country. Today, neuroscience is discovering that meditation literally changes brain structure, creating new neural pathways and enhancing cognitive function. Research on consciousness suggests that the mind may access information from sources beyond the physical brain, exactly what Cayce described as universal consciousness. But the most important validation comes from the thousands of people who have applied Cayce's meditation teachings and experienced the same types of spiritual transformation described in the original study group readings. These groups, known as study groups, continue to meet today. The frequency of meetings can vary, weekly, bi-weekly, or monthly. Most groups meet in private homes or public facilities and generally consist of 4 to 10 members. The fact that these groups have continued for over 90 years, with participants reporting consistent spiritual breakthroughs, provides powerful evidence that Cayce's approach to meditation represents more than just philosophical speculation. There is nothing new here. The search for God is as old as humanity. Old. This book is passed on in the hope that through it, during the trying times ahead, many may glimpse a ray of light, that in other hearts it may awaken a new hope and vision of a better world through application of his laws in daily life. What Cayce revealed wasn't a new religion or spiritual system, but the rediscovery of ancient wisdom that had been preserved within biblical texts and could be awakened through meditation practice. The practical instructions for beginning this practice are surprisingly straightforward. Consecrate yourselves this day is given in the law, that ye may on the morrow present yourselves before the Lord, that he may speak through you, as a father speaketh with his children. This consecration begins with setting aside time each day for meditation, preferably in the morning when the mind is clear and the day's activities haven't yet created mental clutter. The Edgar Cayce reading suggested that Eastern spirituality and Western spirituality should be as one, and his approach to meditation combined them. In each weekly meeting, the group studies excerpts from the Bible, the Search for God books or other sources, meditates and then sends the energy raised in meditation out in prayer for others. This integration of biblical study with meditation practice creates a unique approach that honors both intellectual understanding and direct spiritual experience. The results speak for themselves. Books I and the Tai, here combined in one volume, are based on so-called readings dictated by the sleeping prophet Edgar Cayce in weekly sessions witnessed by members of a study group from 1931 to 1942. This work may represent the gold standard 10 out of 10 of extrasensory prophetic wisdom revealed in the 20th century. Modern practitioners continue to report the same types of experiences described in the original readings: enhanced intuition, improved health, deeper spiritual awareness, and most significantly, a direct personal relationship with what Cayce called the creative force. Before praying or offering laying on of hands, the glad helpers first meditate. The glad helpers meditate to raise the consciousness of the Christ within themselves. This practice of meditation before prayer or healing work demonstrates how Cayce understood meditation not as an end in itself, but as preparation for service to others. Over and over again, the prayer group members were instructed to always pray for God's will, to work within the person for the highest good in every situation. This surrendering of personal will to divine will represents the ultimate goal of Cayce's meditation practice. Not to get what we want, but to align ourselves with what serves the highest good. The implications of Cayce's teachings extend far beyond personal spiritual development. As love is God, it is therefore our abundant supply. Do we lack? Do we love? This suggests that the consciousness developed through meditation practice can actually influence material circumstances, not through magical thinking, but through alignment with the creative principles that govern existence. The power of love is unlimited. We alone set metes and bounds. We can choose to use our love constructively or selfishly. We may uplift our fellow humans or crush ideals, instigate revolts, or wreck civilization. This places enormous responsibility on those who develop spiritual awareness through meditation practice. With expanded consciousness comes the obligation to use that consciousness for the benefit of all. These records form the foundation of the Association for Research and Enlightenment's activities and make Edgar Cayce one of the most documented psychics of the 20th century. The meticulous documentation of Cayce's readings means that anyone can verify the consistency and practical effectiveness of his teachings about meditation and spiritual development. During Edgar Cayce's lifetime, 1877-1945, all of the records of his psychic readings were his personal property. After Edgar Cayce and his wife Gertrude died in 1945, the records became the property of their sons, Hugh Lynn Cayce and Edgar Evans Cayce, and secretary Gladys Davis Turner. The preservation of these records ensures that future generations can continue to study and apply the meditation principles that Cayce revealed. In February 1948, the Edgar Cayce Foundation was chartered by the Commonwealth of Virginia to provide permanent legal and physical custody of historical resources, including the Edgar Cayce readings themselves and various compilations of extracts from the readings. This institutional preservation guarantees that Cayce's teachings about meditation will remain available for ongoing research and application. Today, as humanity faces unprecedented challenges, the meditation practices revealed through Edgar Cayce offer more than personal transformation. They provide a pathway to the expanded consciousness that may be essential for our collective survival and evolution. In this material world, we are conscious of the phenomenon of growth. We should be equally aware of spiritual progression that includes both a broadening of understanding of the relation between the Creator and ourselves, and a definite improvement in capacities for more useful lives. The meditation practice that Cayce revealed isn't about escaping the world, but about engaging more effectively with the challenges we face. By accessing the same spiritual consciousness that guided biblical figures, we can find solutions to problems that seem impossible from ordinary awareness. Until we can love others, we have not even begun to develop. And development is exactly what Mr. Cayce's work is all about. This development isn't just personal, but collective. As more people learn to access expanded consciousness through meditation, humanity as a whole evolves toward what Cayce called the Christ consciousness, a state of awareness characterized by unconditional love, wisdom, and service to others. The choice facing each person is the same one that faced the original study group members in 1931. Are you willing to dedicate yourself to the daily practice necessary to develop your spiritual potential? In 1931, Edgar Cayce agreed to help a group of people grow spiritually and become more psychic with one condition. They would have to live the precepts. This condition remains unchanged. The meditation practices revealed through Cayce's readings aren't theoretical but practical technologies that must be applied consistently to produce results. It took the group 11 years to apply and compile the 24 lessons that became A Search for God, Books I and II. This material has helped individuals and groups around the world to discover a closer attunement to God. The fact that it took 11 years demonstrates the depth and seriousness of this work. Developing spiritual consciousness through meditation isn't a quick fix, but a lifelong journey of growth and service. Yet the rewards are beyond anything that ordinary consciousness can imagine. To these individuals, it brought hope, peace, a better understanding of their fellow human beings, and an inner joy and a greater awareness of attunement with the Creator. This attunement with the Creator represents the ultimate goal of human existence according to Cayce's teachings, not as a future reward, but as a present possibility available to anyone willing to undertake the necessary practice. The meditation techniques themselves are surprisingly accessible, requiring no special equipment or esoteric knowledge. Each week will have a different theme, chosen by the group as the practice evolves. This flexibility allows the practice to adapt to individual needs and circumstances, while maintaining the core principles that Cayce revealed. A student of the Cayce readings, focusing on the 262 and 281 series, Karen has held a daily prayer and meditation devotion for over 17 years. The consistency demonstrated by long-term practitioners provides evidence that Cayce's approach to meditation can be sustained over decades, continuing to provide growth and insight throughout a lifetime of practice. Most importantly, Cayce's teachings about meditation restore the understanding that every human being has direct access to divine consciousness. Then, and only then, can you approach another as the Christ Spirit would, meeting each of us exactly where we are. This democratization of spiritual access means that the same consciousness that spoke through the great biblical figures is available to every person willing to create the conditions for its expression through meditation practice. The question isn't whether these teachings are true or whether meditation really works. Thousands of documented cases over nearly a century provide overwhelming evidence of their practical effectiveness. The only question is whether you're ready to begin the journey that could transform not just your personal life, but your understanding of what it means to be human in this extraordinary universe, where consciousness itself may be the fundamental creative force. As Edgar Cayce demonstrated through his own life and teachings, the kingdom of heaven isn't a distant destination, but a present reality accessible through the ancient yet ever-new practice of meditation. The hidden key that unlocks the spiritual treasures preserved within the Bible and sleeping within your own consciousness. Your meditation practice awaits. The only requirement is sincerity, consistency, and the willingness to discover what the prophets knew, what Jesus demonstrated, and what Edgar Cayce revealed, that you are, right now, a spiritual being with unlimited potential for love, wisdom, and service in this world that desperately needs what you have to offer. In one of his most impactful readings from 1932, at the height of the Great Depression, Edgar Cayce was approached by a middle-aged man who carried in his eyes the weight of decades of suffering. He wasn't there to talk about finances, physical health, or family problems. What tormented him was an addiction that had destroyed not only his life, but also the lives of everyone around him. Alcohol. This man had lost his job, alienated his family, and compromised his dignity. He believed his problem was only physical and emotional, but Cayce saw something much deeper, a spiritual debt accumulated across multiple lifetimes. During the session, in deep trance, Cayce described that this addiction wasn't merely the result of choices from this life. It was a repeated pattern, rooted in experiences from other incarnations, where substance abuse had harmed not only himself, but also hundreds of other people. This revelation didn't come as condemnation, but as spiritual diagnosis. The present compulsion was a reflection of an energetic and moral debt that still needed to be paid. According to Cayce, every action, especially those that interfere with the life and well-being of others, leaves a mark on the soul, and this mark crosses time until it is corrected by consciousness and real behavioral change. What was most impressive was when Cayce revealed details about how this debt manifested almost inevitably. He explained that the soul carries memories and inclinations from other lives that shape our impulses in the present. In this man's case, in a previous incarnation, he had been a liquor merchant in a busy port region, using his influence to encourage excessive consumption and profiting from others' degradation. In another, more ancient life, he had been a tribal leader who encouraged intoxication rituals to manipulate community decisions. These choices, repeated and reinforced over centuries, created a connecting thread that crossed time and reincarnated with him. The current addiction, therefore, wasn't just a problem of this life, but the final result of a sequence of spiritual decisions that demanded reparation. Cayce, with his calm voice, stated that ignoring this pattern would only guarantee its repetition in future incarnations, perhaps in even more destructive forms. The healing process, therefore, couldn't be merely physical with abstinence or medications, but should include a deep commitment to moral transformation and service to others, as a way to balance the damaged energies. This approach went far beyond the medicine of the time and shocked those present, as it placed spiritual responsibility at the center of recovery. During that session, held at the ARE headquarters in Virginia Beach, Cayce made sure to connect the individual experience to the universal law of cause and effect. He emphasized that each act of indulgence that harms another human being generates an energetic consequence that inevitably returns to its creator, not as arbitrary punishment, but as the soul's natural learning mechanism. Alcohol, according to him, wasn't just a physical substance. For certain souls, it was also a condensed symbol of repeated choices that weaken the will and obscure spiritual clarity. By allowing addiction to dominate their life, the person not only harmed themselves, but also created waves of impact on their family, friends, and community. These waves, on the spiritual plane, were recorded in the so-called Akashic records, which Cayce described as the living memory of the universe. And there every thought, word and action were preserved with absolute precision, awaiting the moment when the soul would be ready to confront and correct them. The man before him wept silently, as Cayce, still in trance, described that there was no eternal condemnation, but there was indeed an inevitable need to rebalance the scales. Most striking was the way Cayce presented the solution. He didn't speak of superficial penances or empty promises. Instead, he guided the man to immediately begin a path of active service, seeking to help others who struggled with the same addiction. He said that each genuine gesture of aid to another human being would equal a partial payment of this accumulated debt. With each life in which the man helped others break free, the karmic weight would be reduced until the inclination toward addiction ceased to be part of his spiritual pattern. For Cayce, this was true redemption, not just stopping drinking, but transforming one's very existence into a living antidote against the evil he had once propagated. This perspective not only revolutionized that man's understanding, but also inspired many who heard this reading to reflect on their own habits, recognizing that each choice has a dimension that goes far beyond what we can see. And it was at that moment that Cayce said something that gave everyone in the room chills. The spirit doesn't seek perfection to be accepted by God. It seeks perfection because it has already been touched by Him. This phrase ended the session with profound silence, as if everyone there had just glimpsed the gravity and beauty of the soul's journey. After that revelation, Cayce asked the man to reflect deeply on what kept him bound to alcohol. He explained that, in many readings, he had observed a pattern. Addiction isn't born only from momentary pleasure, but as an escape from a much older pain, which sometimes doesn't even belong to this life. He said that some carry traumas from past incarnations so intense that upon being reborn, they feel an inexplicable void, an echo of memories they cannot consciously access, but which shape emotions and decisions. Alcohol, in these cases, functions as anesthesia for the soul, muffling the inner call to face unresolved issues. For Cayce, healing only begins when the person accepts looking within and recognizing that pain isn't an enemy, but a messenger. He described that on the spiritual plane, each time someone gives in to addiction, it's as if they reinforce a vibrational mark that weakens the capacity for connection with higher energies. Therefore, liberation requires not just willpower, but a spiritual repositioning, replacing the search for numbness with the search for meaning. Cayce also highlighted that, for certain souls, addiction is part of a learning contract assumed before incarnating. This doesn't mean the person is condemned to suffer, but that their struggle can become an example and a beacon for others. He cited cases of individuals who, after overcoming decades of dependency, dedicated the rest of their lives to helping others break free, and that this dedication immensely accelerated their spiritual evolution. In a reading during the war years, he reported the case of a veteran who, in another life, had led entire communities to ruin through illicit liquor trade. In this incarnation, the man was reborn with a strong inclination toward alcoholism, but managed to overcome it and founded a rehabilitation center that saved hundreds of people. Cayce explained that each sincere act of help rewrote, in the Akashic records, the history of that soul, replacing records of destruction with records of reconstruction. Thus, spiritual debt wasn't an eternal burden, but an invitation to transformation. During the 1932 session, he also warned about something few understand: the influence of negative spiritual bonds formed in moments of intoxication. According to Cayce, when someone is under the influence of alcohol, their energetic field becomes vulnerable, allowing spiritual entities with lower vibrations to approach and even influence thoughts and behaviors. In some readings, he described that such connections can cross physical death and reactivate in future lives, creating cycles of compulsion that seem inexplicable from a purely psychological standpoint. This vision shocked those present, as it meant addiction wasn't just an internal problem, but also a constant spiritual battle. To interrupt this cycle, Cayce recommended daily practices of prayer, meditation, and altruistic service as a way to strengthen personal energy and reduce vulnerability to external influences. He insisted that, with spiritual discipline, It was possible to completely change the soul's vibrational tuning. The man who had heard all this left that session visibly shaken, but with a different look, as if he had received simultaneously a diagnosis and a map to freedom. Cayce, for his part, concluded by reinforcing that true repentance isn't just feeling remorse, but acting to create a positive impact that surpasses the harm caused. He said that in spiritual terms, redemption is proportional to the intensity and constancy with which the person works to transform themselves and help others. If in another life you led many to the bottom of the pit, Cayce stated, in this life, lead many to the light. This advice resonated not only in the man who received it, but in all who witnessed that reading. Decades later, reports indicated that man had followed the indicated path, helping countless others overcome addiction, and that his life had transformed into a living example of what Cayce called karmic balance in action. Yes, Cayce made clear that addiction, especially alcohol, didn't end with the death of the physical body. In various readings preserved in the ARE archives, he explained that consciousness maintains the same desires and tendencies after transition. The difference is that on the spiritual plane, there's no physical body to satisfy these impulses, which generates an insatiable thirst and a state of profound anguish. He described that spirits trapped in this condition often remain close to bars, parties, or environments where alcohol is consumed, trying to absorb uselessly the sensation they had in life. This is what he called vibrational prison, a state where the soul remains connected to the same vibrations it cultivated, unable to rise until there's a genuine internal change. This revelation, made during a reading in the early 40s, left an entire family in silence. They sought to understand why a deceased relative seemed to haunt certain places, and Cayce explained that the spirit simply couldn't disconnect from what had dominated it most in life. He warned that this condition wasn't a punishment imposed by God, but a natural consequence of the law of affinity. The soul gravitates toward what's in tune with its internal vibration. If this vibration is shaped by destructive compulsions, even death doesn't immediately alter the scenario. Cayce said that in these cases, the only possible liberation was the fruit of an internal decision, often aided by sincere prayers from loved ones or intervention by more evolved spirits. He even reported that in the spiritual world, there are true recovery houses for souls struggling with addictions, where they receive assistance and guidance until they can regain control of themselves. However, he warned that this process could take a very long time, even centuries, depending on the soul's resistance to change. Most impactful was hearing that, after this period, the soul almost always chose to reincarnate in circumstances that would place it before the same challenge, but now with new opportunities for overcoming. In a case recorded in Virginia Beach, Cayce reported that a woman in a past life had been an indirect victim of her father's alcoholism, but in another incarnation, she became the one who carried the addiction herself. He explained that this role exchange was one of the most effective forms of learning, as it allowed the soul to understand the consequences of its actions from all possible angles. This understanding wasn't theoretical, it was visceral, engraved in the memory of consciousness. Thus, upon reincarnating, the person not only faces their own challenge, but carries deep down the memory of the pain they caused or suffered. Cayce saw in this the perfect justice of karmic law, not as punishment, but as continuous spiritual education. He stated that, as long as there wasn't a true break with the pattern, whether in this life or another, the tendency would return, sometimes with more force, until the soul finally chose liberation. This perspective made many who heard his readings begin to see addiction not as an isolated moral weakness, but as part of a much larger story that spans centuries. Cayce insisted that this didn't diminish individual responsibility. On the contrary, it amplified it. You're not just fighting for yourself, he would say, you're fighting for the liberation of an entire line of existences that carry your spiritual signature. By understanding this, many people found renewed motivation to seek help, break harmful habits, and dedicate themselves to good. For Cayce, each small victory against addiction was a step not only toward physical and emotional health, but also toward true spiritual ascension, a movement that echoed in all past lives and shaped all future ones. Cayce believed that breaking the cycle of addiction in this life was not only possible, but highly recommended to prevent the soul from carrying the same struggle to future incarnations. In various readings, he described a set of spiritual and physical practices that, when applied with discipline, created a kind of new programming for consciousness. The first recommendation was daily prayer, not as mechanical repetition, but as intimate dialogue with the divine. He emphasized that prayer aligned with sincere intention produced a real change in the soul's vibration, gradually weakening the attraction to destructive habits. The second practice was service to others, especially those facing similar challenges. For Cayce, this was the most powerful antidote against the spiritual forces that feed addiction, because by helping another human being break free, the person also liberated themselves at levels they couldn't immediately perceive. Another central recommendation was purification of the physical body, not just to restore health, but to facilitate spiritual elevation. Cayce suggested a diet based on fruits, fresh vegetables and whole grains, minimizing processed foods and stimulants. He believed that a clean body facilitated connection with higher levels of consciousness and reduced vulnerability to negative spiritual influences. Additionally, he advised salt baths and regular sessions of moderate exercise to strengthen the nervous system, which, according to him, was heavily impacted by prolonged alcohol consumption. He also recommended meditation practice, not just as relaxation, but as a means to re-educate the mind, replacing self-destructive thought patterns with constructive images and ideas aligned with the soul's purpose. Cayce insisted that these practices would only be effective if accompanied by genuine emotional and moral commitment. He warned that some people tried to negotiate with addiction, reducing consumption instead of abandoning it completely, but this rarely worked because the vibrational pattern remained active. In his readings, he used a simple metaphor. It's like trying to clean a polluted river by throwing in a cup of clean water. You need to change the source, not just dilute the problem. For him, this source change meant completely reorienting life, seeking a purpose greater than momentary pleasure. In many cases, he indicated that this purpose came from using one's own talents for others' benefit, whether in work, art, teaching, or any area where the individual could serve. Finally, Cayce emphasized that the journey of liberation from addiction shouldn't be seen as punishment, but as an extraordinary opportunity for spiritual growth. He reminded that souls who managed to overcome deep compulsions often became spiritual leaders, healers and guides for many others. What was once a wound became a source of strength and wisdom. He said that in the spiritual world, these souls were seen as warriors of light because they had faced and conquered internal battles that few have the courage to face. And he always left a reminder that echoed far beyond the reading room in Virginia Beach. The victory you achieve over yourself today is a gift your soul will enjoy for all eternity. When Cayce spoke about the spiritual consequences for those who overcame addiction, his tone changed. He moved from warning to a dimension of almost palpable hope. He said that liberation from a deep addiction, like alcohol, not only healed the present life, but rewrote the entire trajectory of the soul in the Akashic records. According to him, each time a soul managed to break a pattern repeated for centuries, something like an entire spiritual timeline was adjusted, freeing not only the individual, but also people and situations that had been affected by their past actions. This victory created a new energy frequency, which began to attract opportunities, relationships, and experiences aligned with a higher level of consciousness. In readings recorded in the post-war years, Cayce went so far as to say that some souls, upon overcoming addiction, advanced decades or even centuries in their evolutionary process. He explained that this happened because the spiritual strength developed in the struggle against dependency strengthened the soul for much greater challenges, transforming old weak points into true power points. For him, a person who genuinely overcame alcohol not only freed themselves, but began to radiate a presence capable of inspiring transformation in others, often without even speaking about their experience. It was as if that soul's energetic field carried living proof that change is possible, attracting people ready to listen and change. Cayce also described that, after death, these souls didn't pass through the same dense regions where they would have been trapped before. Instead, they were received in higher planes, where they could serve as spiritual helpers for those still suffering. He reported cases where spirits of former addicts acted in spiritual hospitals, helping newly deceased understand their condition and begin the healing process. This service, according to him, further accelerated the soul's evolution and created a virtuous cycle of learning and contribution. It was living proof that what had once been the greatest weakness could become the greatest strength. For Cayce, this was the true meaning of redemption, not erasing the past, but transforming it into a source of light. He insisted that every person, no matter how deep they were in addiction, carried within themselves the seed of this transformation. They just needed to choose to water it day after day with thoughts, words, and actions aligned with life and not self-destruction. And he concluded by remembering that God doesn't measure the soul's value by the fall, but by the willingness to get up and walk again. Each time you choose light instead of shadow, you're writing a new page in the eternal history of your soul, he would say. This vision left his listeners with something much more powerful than fear of addiction's consequences, the certainty that victory is possible and that each effort, however small it may seem, has an eternal impact. Now, if you've made it this far, it's because something in this message touched you. Therefore, subscribe, like, and share this video so that more people can know the transformative truth that Edgar Cayce left about liberation from addiction. Who knows if your action today might be exactly what another soul needs to take the first step towards spiritual freedom. Edgar Cayce shocked many when he declared that fasting was not just about physical health, but about unlocking the very essence of the soul. What he revealed next would change everything people thought they knew about this ancient practice. Imagine hearing that skipping meals could open a channel between your mind and the divine, transforming not only your body, but your destiny. In one of his most striking sessions during the Great Depression, Cayce explained that fasting purified the physical temple so that the spiritual forces could flow without resistance. He described it as a sacred reset that aligned the body with the eternal laws of God. But here's what nobody expected. While people of his time were familiar with fasting as a religious tradition, they were unprepared for the way Cayce framed it as an active tool for spiritual evolution and healing. He wasn't speaking in vague metaphors, but giving detailed practical guidance. He revealed that true fasting was less about denial and more about redirection, shifting energy from the digestive system toward higher levels of consciousness, where the soul could hear God's voice more clearly. Cayce's readings went further, insisting that fasting was a way to strengthen the will and cleanse the mind from destructive patterns that often repeated across lifetimes. For him, this wasn't superstition but direct insight from the same universal intelligence he accessed in trance. He warned that the modern lifestyle, full of excess food and distraction, dulled spiritual sensitivity. When a person practiced fasting sincerely, they didn't just feel lighter in body, they felt closer to Jesus Christ, the ultimate model of discipline, surrender, and alignment with God. And then came the revelation that left audiences speechless. Cayce tied fasting directly to the life of Christ, reminding his listeners that Jesus often withdrew to fast and pray before major decisions, battles, or revelations. By echoing that practice, the seeker could tap into the same spiritual current. And here is what nobody expected. Cayce emphasized that fasting, done with humility and prayer, opened the subconscious channels where the soul could access guidance from the divine. One of the most powerful readings, documented in the archives of the ARE in Virginia Beach, described how a man struggling with deep depression and illness experienced transformation after applying Cayce's fasting instructions. During that session, Cayce explained that the physical body was overloaded with toxins, but more importantly, the man's spirit was weighed down by fear and guilt. Through a simple but disciplined fast, combined with daily prayer, the man felt not only restored in health but renewed in purpose. What stunned the attendees was how Cayce described the process. Fasting burned away not only physical impurities, but karmic residues, freeing the soul from chains it had carried across lifetimes. This revelation drew gasps because it connected something as simple as abstaining from food with the deepest mysteries of reincarnation and spiritual evolution. Cayce did not present fasting as punishment, but as liberation, a pathway that allowed the divine to flow without obstruction. The historical context made these revelations even more dramatic. During the harsh years of economic despair in the 1930s, when families across America struggled with hunger not by choice but by circumstance, Cayce's words redefined fasting. For the poor, fasting was suffering. For Cayce, when chosen deliberately and framed with spiritual purpose, fasting became a ladder to God. But there was a crucial distinction that changed everything. He differentiated between involuntary lack and conscious discipline, showing that intention was everything. A farmer from Kentucky, desperate for hope, once asked Cayce if his inability to feed his family meant that he was unconsciously closer to God. Cayce replied with compassion but clarity, "True fasting requires willing surrender, not forced deprivation. The power comes not from hunger itself, but from the inner choice to direct the soul toward God's light." When Edgar Cayce spoke about fasting, he often warned that it was not a mechanical act. It was not about how many hours someone avoided food or how many days they could endure hunger. He made it clear that fasting without prayer, meditation, and conscious intention was simply starvation. The true spiritual power came when fasting was accompanied by a focus on Christ, on inner cleansing, and on redirecting the will. In one of his most impactful readings of 1932, Cayce explained that the body is a temple designed to reflect divine order, and when the digestive system rested, the spirit could move into the empty space with clarity. He said that just as spring cleaning renews a house, fasting renewed the human vessel for divine use. This idea shook the people present because it reframed fasting from an old religious ritual into a living technology for spiritual growth. He reminded them that when the body is heavy and clogged, the mind is sluggish, but when the body is clear, the soul can rise. Cayce often connected fasting with the concept of discipline, something he saw as critical for breaking cycles of weakness carried across lifetimes. He described how the act of voluntarily withholding food built inner strength that could then be applied to overcoming anger, lust, fear, or addictions. In his words, what is mastered in the body may be mastered in the soul. He described the fast not as denial but as training, like a soldier preparing for battle, except the battle was within. He pointed directly to the example of Jesus Christ, fasting in the wilderness before facing temptation. For Cayce, this was not symbolic but literal evidence that fasting strengthens the will against forces, seen and unseen, that seek to pull the soul away from God. When skeptics asked if this was just psychological, Cayce responded that psychology and spirit are intertwined, and that fasting allows the subconscious to realign with divine law. This was Cayce at his boldest, turning a simple act into a cosmic practice. One of the most dramatic moments happened during a session in Virginia Beach, when Cayce addressed a woman who had struggled with destructive habits for decades. Her body was failing, and her spirit was heavy. Cayce, in trance, prescribed not only a short fast, but also a spiritual practice during those days, reading the Gospel of John aloud, praying at sunrise, and using the fast as a period to forgive others and herself. Witnesses described how her entire presence changed after following these instructions. It was not simply that her health improved, it was her eyes, her voice, her very energy. She radiated peace. For those who doubted, this case became living evidence that fasting was not about the stomach, but about the soul's alignment with Christ. Cayce explained that during her fast, she opened herself to the healing power of divine love, and that was why transformation happened so quickly. The shock to the audience was not that she felt better, but that her whole life shifted in direction. Throughout his lifetime, Cayce often contrasted modern science with spiritual truth. Doctors of his time saw fasting as a medical curiosity at best, or a danger at worst. Cayce challenged that view, saying that science was still blind to the spiritual dimension of human existence. He never rejected medicine, but argued that the deeper cure always involved the soul. "Cleanse the body and you cleanse the channels of the spirit," he once said, highlighting that fasting was not against science but beyond it. He predicted that one day science would recognize how fasting triggers processes of renewal in both body and mind, and history would prove him right. Decades later, research on fasting began to confirm benefits Cayce had already described: detoxification, mental clarity, and healing responses. Yet Cayce's perspective reached further. He said fasting clears not only physical toxins, but also energetic residues that block the soul's connection to God. Edgar Cayce never separated fasting from the greater journey of the soul. He taught that the body, mind, and spirit are woven together in a single pattern, and fasting was one of the rare practices that touched all three at once. In one of his sessions that changed the life of an entire family, he explained that fasting helped dissolve barriers carried over from past incarnations. According to him, the weight we feel is not always just physical. It is the accumulation of choices, regrets, and attachments from many lifetimes. Fasting, when practiced with prayer and focus on Christ, could loosen these invisible chains. He described it as opening a window between the present life and the eternal self, allowing divine light to pour in. This startled the people listening because it suggested that something as ordinary as abstaining from food had cosmic consequences. It was not just about the body resting, but about the soul remembering its true origin in God. During the years of war, many turned to Cayce not only for medical guidance, but for comfort. Families in Virginia Beach and Hopkinsville asked how to keep faith when chaos seemed endless. Cayce reminded them that fasting, combined with prayer for others, was a way to anchor peace within while the world burned outside. He told them that Christ himself had taught this principle: when you fast, do it not with sadness but with a spirit turned to heaven, and God will reward you in secret. Cayce emphasized that fasting became powerful when used for service, when someone fasted not only for personal clarity, but to lift others in prayer. In this way, he connected individual discipline with community healing. One soldier's mother reported that during her fast and prayers, she felt an overwhelming presence of peace, even as her son was far across the ocean. Cayce explained that fasting had opened her channel to receive the assurance of the Spirit, giving her strength to endure. Another striking theme in Cayce's teachings was his warning against approaching fasting mechanically, as if it were magic. He said that many people failed because they treated fasting as a test of willpower rather than an offering of surrender. The goal was never endurance, but alignment. He insisted that without humility, fasting could even increase pride, making a person think themselves holier than others. To prevent this, Cayce recommended simple, structured practices. Begin with prayer, choose a short fast rather than extremes, and always end it with gratitude and moderation. He described fasting as a conversation between the body and God, where each hunger pang was a reminder to redirect thought toward Christ. Instead of fighting hunger with bitterness, the seeker was to use it as a call to prayer, a moment to lift the mind above the body. In this way, fasting became not deprivation, but constant communion. Cayce also addressed the fear many had about the physical risks of fasting. Doctors in the 1930s and 40s warned against it, claiming it weakened the body dangerously. Cayce disagreed, clarifying that short, purposeful fasts were not only safe, but healing. He often recommended simple methods: fruit juices, water, sometimes a day or two of complete abstinence, depending on the individual's condition. What mattered most was the spiritual frame behind it. In one reading preserved in the ARE archives, he explained that the body uses fasting as a time of repair, cleansing tissues and resetting natural rhythms. But he stressed again, without prayer, the fast remains only physical. With prayer, it becomes sacred. He often repeated that the highest purpose of fasting was to prepare the body as a clear vessel so that the soul could receive divine impressions. Make the body a fit channel for the Spirit, he said, a phrase that many who heard him never forgot. Cayce's understanding of fasting was rooted in the belief that the human body is more than flesh and blood. It is a living temple designed to channel divine energy. He often reminded seekers that if the body is clogged with impurities and the mind is filled with worry, the spirit cannot express itself freely. Fasting, then, was like sweeping the floors of a sacred sanctuary, removing what blocked the presence of God. In one reading that left the audience stunned, he described fasting as loosening the cords of bondage, not only freeing the body from poisons, but also releasing the heart from resentment and the mind from confusion. He urged people not to see fasting as punishment, but as preparation. Just as a musician tunes an instrument before a performance, fasting tuned the body for the soul's music. This comparison made the teaching practical and unforgettable because it gave people a new way to imagine the sacredness of their physical vessel. Perhaps the most shocking claim Cayce made was that fasting could affect not only the present life, but the soul's journey after death. He explained that when we leave this world, we carry the state of our consciousness with us. If the mind is clouded by greed, fear, or attachment, the transition can be heavy and confusing. But when a person has practiced fasting with prayer, they train themselves to detach from what is temporary and cling to what is eternal. He said, fasting was rehearsal for dying well, an exercise in letting go of the physical so that the spirit could rise freely. This revelation left many silent because it tied a simple earthly discipline to the ultimate destiny of the soul. According to Cayce, those who learned to fast with humility and devotion were better prepared to walk into eternity with clarity and peace closer to Christ. There was also a communal side to his teaching. Cayce encouraged groups to fast together, not for show but for shared strength. He believed that when several people fasted with one heart and one prayer, the spiritual energy multiplied. During the years of the Great Depression, some groups in Virginia Beach gathered not only to study the Bible, but to practice short fasts while praying for their neighbors who were unemployed, sick, or hopeless. The testimonies that came from these gatherings were powerful. People spoke of renewed courage, of unexpected opportunities, and of a deep sense of being held by God's presence. Cayce explained that collective fasting created a channel through which spiritual power could flow into a community, lifting burdens that no one person could carry alone. He connected this practice to the early Christians, who often combined fasting with prayer when seeking guidance or facing persecution. One element that consistently set Cayce apart was his insistence on balance. He never promoted extreme fasting or self-destruction. Instead, he stressed moderation, reminding people that the body is a gift from God and must be cared for. He often advised seekers to listen to their own constitution, to fast lightly but intentionally, and to return to nourishing foods with gratitude. For him, the fast was never about how long someone could endure without food, but about how much the soul could open to divine truth during that time. He also gave practical advice, resting during a fast, avoiding unnecessary labor, and spending more time in meditation or scripture reading. These details showed that Cayce did not treat fasting as a vague idea, but as a concrete practice, grounded in daily life. What made his guidance extraordinary was that it always pointed beyond the physical to the eternal, turning every detail into an opportunity to align with Christ. During one particularly moving session, Cayce was asked whether fasting could truly heal deep illnesses, or if it was only symbolic. His answer was both practical and spiritual. He explained that the body has natural powers of regeneration that awaken when the digestive system rests, and that this physical cleansing allowed the nervous system and glands to reset. But he insisted the deeper healing came from the soul's realignment during the fast. He recounted how individuals who fasted while meditating on the life of Christ often experienced not only relief from physical pain, but breakthroughs in long-standing emotional wounds. To Cayce, disease was never only in the body, it was in the mind, the attitudes, the spirit. Fasting simply opened the door so that God's healing could flow without resistance. One unforgettable example preserved in the ARE archives described a man who had battled alcoholism for years. Nothing seemed to break the cycle until Cayce recommended a 3-day fruit juice fast, combined with daily prayers of surrender to Christ. The man later testified that for the first time in decades he felt his cravings weaken. He described it as if a fog had lifted from his mind, allowing him to see his life clearly. Cayce explained that the fast had helped cleanse not only the physical body, but also the subconscious patterns tied to guilt and self-destruction. For him, fasting was not magic, but cooperation with divine law. When the body is cleared, the spirit can move more freely. Witnesses saw this case as proof that fasting could reach into places medicine could not touch, liberating the soul from invisible chains. Cayce warned, however, that the real victory came not from the fast alone, but from continuing a life of prayer and service after it ended. Cayce often compared fasting to tuning a radio. He explained that the human mind constantly receives impressions, but when cluttered with excess, the signal becomes static. Fasting, he said, cleared the static so the soul could receive God's broadcast. The analogy struck people deeply, especially in an era when radios were the center of every home. Just as families tuned into clear frequencies, Cayce explained, the soul needed to tune into divine truth. Hunger pangs became reminders to shift focus away from fear and back toward Christ. He even described fasting as one of the simplest tools for aligning with the Akashic records, the universal memory of the soul, because it quieted the body long enough for the deeper self to speak. This teaching transformed the way many viewed their daily struggles, giving them hope that their discipline could open doors to wisdom and healing far beyond their imagination. What shocked skeptics most was Cayce's claim that fasting could directly impact one's spiritual vision. He said that many people live blinded by material desires, unable to sense the presence of God all around them. Through fasting, however, the veil thins, and the soul perceives what is usually hidden. People reported vivid dreams, sudden insights, even a sense of spiritual companionship during fasts. Cayce explained that this was natural. When the physical body quiets, the spiritual body awakens. He reminded his audiences that Christ himself said, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be filled." For Cayce, this was not poetic language, but literal truth. Fasting created the hunger, prayer created the thirst, and God himself filled the soul. This message electrified those who heard it because it tied the act of fasting directly to the promise of divine encounter. Cayce also addressed a subtle but crucial truth. Fasting without love was empty. He warned that some seekers approached fasting as a competition, as if God would reward the longest endurance. He dismantled that idea completely, saying the power of fasting is measured not in hours or days, but in the sincerity of the heart. He told a group in Hopkinsville that the real test was not how long one could go without food, but whether the fast inspired greater compassion, forgiveness, and service to others. If someone fasted but returned to anger, pride, or selfishness, they had missed the purpose. In his words, "Let the fast be not of bread alone, but of bitterness, of hatred, of judgment." That statement stunned the room because it elevated fasting into a total cleansing of body, mind, and heart. He explained that the greatest fast was not measured on a clock, but in the soul's willingness to release what kept it far from God. In another remarkable session during the Second World War, Cayce spoke to families burdened with fear for their sons and daughters overseas. Many asked if fasting could somehow protect their loved ones. Cayce did not promise miracles, but he did affirm that fasting with prayer created a channel of strength that could reach across oceans. He urged mothers and fathers to fast not out of despair, but out of faith, turning every pang of hunger into an intercession for their children. Testimonies later recorded showed that many found supernatural peace in the midst of their fasting, even when news from the front was grim. Some described dreams of their loved ones surrounded by light, which gave them courage to endure. Cayce explained that fasting heightened spiritual sensitivity, allowing people to sense realities beyond the physical world. What shocked many was his claim that such practices could indeed influence unseen forces, creating ripples that touched lives far away. One of Cayce's most consistent messages was that fasting must always end with gratitude. He taught that when breaking a fast, one should not rush to overindulge, but pause to thank God for every bite, recognizing food as sacred provision. He often suggested beginning again with simple fruits or broths, allowing the body to gently return to its rhythm. This closing act of humility sealed the spiritual benefits of the fast. He also encouraged people to journal during their fasting periods, recording insights, dreams, and reflections as a way to anchor the lessons learned. Many followers reported that their greatest breakthroughs did not happen during the fast itself, but in the quiet days after, when clarity emerged like dawn after a long night. Cayce explained that fasting was like planting seeds, and the harvest often came later. This teaching gave people patience and trust, showing them that transformation unfolds in God's timing, not in human schedules. What made Cayce's view of fasting so radical was the way he linked it to the life of Christ at every step. He insisted that fasting was not just an ancient tradition or a personal discipline, it was the very path Jesus walked to prepare for his mission. Cayce said that when Christ fasted in the wilderness, he was demonstrating the power of surrender, showing humanity that divine strength comes when the body decreases and the spirit increases. For Cayce, every fast was a way of imitating Christ, drawing closer to his example. He reminded his listeners that Jesus said, "When you fast, not if you fast," making it clear that fasting was expected in the spiritual journey. By tying his guidance so directly to the teachings of Jesus, Cayce gave fasting an authority that even skeptics found hard to dismiss. He positioned it as a bridge between the earthly and the eternal, a sacred discipline that aligned the soul with the Son of God. Cayce frequently reminded seekers that fasting was not meant to isolate them from the world, but to prepare them to serve it better. He said that after a fast, the true measure of its success was not mystical visions or temporary clarity, but whether the individual returned to life with greater patience, compassion, and courage. He told one group in Virginia Beach that a fast should make a person easier to live with, not harder. If someone became irritable or boastful because of their fast, then they had failed to understand its meaning. This teaching was striking because it shifted the focus from personal achievement to relational transformation. Fasting was a tool to clear away selfishness so the soul could reflect Christ more fully in daily interactions, at work, at home, and in the community. To Cayce, every spiritual practice had to flow outward into love, otherwise it lost its divine purpose. In the 1940s, when America was still recovering from the Depression and entering the turbulence of war, Cayce's words carried even more weight. People were desperate for practical ways to strengthen their inner lives. He explained that fasting was not about escape, but about preparation for endurance. He described how those who practiced fasting with prayer could stand stronger in times of crisis, because they had trained themselves to depend not on the comfort of food, but on the presence of God. This resilience, he said, was exactly what Christ demonstrated in the wilderness. In one documented session, Cayce told a weary factory worker that a single day of fasting and prayer each week would give him more strength than endless worry or overwork. The man later reported feeling renewed and focused, even during 12-hour shifts. Such stories spread quickly, convincing many that fasting was not a luxury for saints, but a discipline for ordinary people in extraordinary times. Cayce also warned about the misuse of fasting for selfish ends. He cautioned that some people approached fasting as a way to demand blessings from God, almost as if it were a bargaining tool. He condemned this mindset, saying fasting is never to manipulate God but to transform oneself. He told seekers that if they fasted while secretly hoping to force an outcome, a promotion, wealth, revenge, they were only starving their bodies while feeding their egos. True fasting, he said, always carried the spirit of surrender, trusting God's will rather than trying to control it. He reminded them that Jesus fasted not to change God, but to align himself with the Father's plan. This distinction became one of the pillars of Cayce's teaching. Fasting is about letting go, not grasping, about opening the hands, not tightening them. When practiced with this humility, fasting became a channel for grace rather than a tool of pride. One of Cayce's most memorable phrases about fasting was, "Let the body rest, that the soul may rise." This simple line captured his entire perspective. He taught that the body, when overfed or overstimulated, weighs the spirit down like heavy chains. By giving the body pause, the soul naturally lifted, like a balloon freed from a stone. Many who heard this imagery never forgot it, and it inspired countless people to approach fasting not with fear but with hope. In practice, it meant that even a short fast, skipping a single meal with prayerful intention, could create a moment of spiritual clarity. Cayce emphasized that small, consistent acts were more powerful than extreme gestures done once. This teaching made fasting accessible to everyone, whether rich or poor, young or old, strong or weak. It was not the size of the sacrifice, but the sincerity of the heart that unlocked the power. And in this, Cayce echoed the very heart of Christ's gospel. For Edgar Cayce, fasting was also a way to confront hidden fears. He often explained that when people feel hunger, What rises to the surface is not only physical discomfort, but also the inner restlessness they usually cover with distractions. He said that during fasting, memories, doubts, and even suppressed guilt often come up. Instead of fearing this process, Cayce urged seekers to embrace it as a cleansing of the soul. He compared it to stirring the bottom of a muddy river. The water becomes clouded at first, but as the silt rises and clears away, the current runs pure again. Many people reported that during fasts, they had dreams or inner impressions that revealed unresolved conflicts or emotions. Cayce taught that this was not a sign of failure, but evidence that fasting was working, because it was pulling hidden burdens into the light where God could heal them. He often tied this inner purification to the example of Christ in the wilderness. Cayce said that when Jesus fasted, he faced not only physical hunger, but the full weight of temptation, fear, and doubt. That confrontation was necessary for his mission. Likewise, when ordinary people fasted, they too would face their own shadows. Cayce emphasized that the point was not to defeat these struggles by willpower alone, but to surrender them to God. He explained that every moment of hunger was an opportunity to pray, "Not my will, but yours be done." In this way, fasting became training for life's greatest challenges. By learning to release control in small acts of fasting, a person built the capacity to release control in larger trials. This perspective gave people courage, showing them that fasting was not weakness, but preparation for spiritual battle. Another striking teaching Cayce offered was that fasting could sharpen spiritual perception in dreams. He explained that when the body rests from heavy digestion, the subconscious becomes more active and receptive. Many who fasted reported unusually vivid dreams, some with symbolic messages and others with startling clarity. Cayce encouraged people to record these dreams because he believed they often contained guidance from the soul or even from divine sources. In one session, he described how a seeker had received a dream during a fast that revealed the root cause of her illness, unforgiveness toward a family member. When she reconciled, her health improved dramatically. Cayce used this case to illustrate that fasting opens channels for the soul to communicate truth that the conscious mind ignores. He warned, however, that discernment was key. Not every dream was divine, but fasting increased the chances of hearing the still, small voice of God. Cayce often reminded people that fasting was not a practice to be feared, but embraced as a gift. He told seekers that fear of hunger was actually fear of losing control, and that surrendering this fear was at the heart of spiritual growth. He explained that when a person deliberately chooses to go without food for a time, they step into a place of trust that God will sustain them in ways beyond the physical. He gave the example of how during the Great Depression, many families lived with involuntary hunger, but those who reframed even their suffering as a period of prayer and dedication to God found unexpected strength. Cayce never minimized the pain of lack, but he said intention transformed experience. He contrasted bitterness with surrender, saying one led to despair, the other to spiritual power. For him, the key difference was whether the soul used hunger to complain or to connect with the eternal. That choice determined whether fasting became torment or transformation. In one of his sessions that people never forgot, Cayce explained that fasting had the ability to retune the soul to its original harmony. He used the image of a harp whose strings had grown loose over years of neglect. The instrument still existed, but it had lost its ability to produce beautiful music. Fasting, he said, was like tightening those strings, restoring resonance with divine law. This metaphor touched many because it made the invisible visible. People could suddenly understand their own spiritual disharmony as something real, and fasting as the tool to restore it. He insisted that even short, simple fasts, when combined with scripture and prayer, could bring profound alignment. He pointed again to Christ, who lived in perfect harmony with God, and showed that fasting was part of his way of maintaining that connection. For Cayce, to fast was to imitate Christ and to slowly restore the lost music of the soul. Cayce also emphasized that fasting was not about abandoning the world, but about returning to it renewed. He told audiences in Virginia Beach that a fast which did not make someone more loving afterward was wasted. The true test, he said, was what happened when the fast ended. How one spoke to family, how one treated co-workers, how one faced temptations. He described fasting as sharpening a sword. The blade is tested not in the fire, but in the battle afterward. In the same way, fasting was preparation, and its fruits appeared in daily life. This teaching corrected those who thought of fasting as an escape or as an act of superiority. Cayce reminded them that Christ fasted not to withdraw permanently, but to prepare for his mission. Every seeker, Cayce taught, should view fasting as training for service, not withdrawal from responsibility. That perspective gave the practice not only spiritual but ethical weight, grounding it in real-world impact. Finally, Cayce always brought fasting back to the central figure of faith, Jesus Christ. He taught that fasting without Christ was like a lamp without oil. It had form, but no light. He urged seekers never to approach fasting as an isolated technique or a mystical shortcut. Instead, it had to be grounded in prayer, scripture, and the imitation of Christ's humility. He said that Jesus's fasts were not acts of self-denial for their own sake, but acts of preparation for service. Every true fast, Cayce insisted, should end with renewed commitment to serve others and glorify God. He described fasting as a cycle: cleansing, revelation, surrender, and service. By walking through that cycle, the soul not only grew stronger, but also became a vessel of healing for others. In closing, Cayce left a legacy that still echoes today. His readings on fasting were not exotic curiosities. They were profound reminders that the human soul is designed for communion with God. He showed that fasting cleanses not just the body but the mind and heart, breaking chains from the past and opening channels to the eternal. He insisted that without Christ at the center, fasting was empty, but with Christ it became a living sacrament. His words challenged science, comforted the suffering, and inspired countless people to see fasting not as deprivation, but as liberation. For him, the true spiritual power of fasting lay in its ability to strip away illusions and return the soul to its source. And perhaps his most enduring lesson was simple yet eternal: fast not to escape the world, but to prepare yourself to love it as Christ loved it. With that, Cayce transformed fasting from an ancient ritual into a living path of renewal for every soul willing to walk it. On a humid morning in Virginia Beach in June of 1932, Edgar Cayce entered one of his most profound trance states. The question posed to him that day would unlock secrets about soul evolution that had remained hidden for millennia. A desperate woman from Cincinnati had traveled hundreds of miles seeking answers about her daughter's mysterious condition, a child who seemed to be living through experiences that belonged to another time, another life. What Cayce revealed in reading 294-189 wasn't just about one family's struggle. It was a comprehensive blueprint for recognizing when the soul's deepest karmic patterns were finally reaching completion. The little girl not only recovered completely, but grew up to become a prominent healer herself, fulfilling what Cayce had seen as the natural unfolding of a soul whose ancient lessons were finally being integrated. For over 4 decades, Edgar Cayce gave more than 14,000 documented readings, with approximately 1/3 focusing on past lives and karmic influences. As documented by the Association for Research and Enlightenment, over 14,000 of these discourses were carefully transcribed by his secretary Gladys Davis and preserved in the ARE archives in Virginia Beach, Virginia. What makes Cayce's work particularly compelling is its consistency across thousands of individual cases, each dealing with real people facing real challenges. Hidden within these meticulously documented sessions lies the most comprehensive understanding of soul evolution ever recorded by a single source. Case after case documented specific karmic patterns, their origins in past lives, and most importantly, the signs that indicated when these patterns were reaching resolution. Unlike theoretical spiritual teachings, these readings provided practical, observable indicators that souls and their families could recognize in their daily lives. Before we explore the signs of karmic completion, we must understand what Cayce meant by karma itself. In the Edgar Cayce readings, karma was explained as meeting self, essentially meeting the consequences of our own actions or attitudes, including our previous thoughts and emotions, from not just this lifetime, but from previous incarnations as well. This wasn't about punishment or cosmic retribution. The readings maintained that each person is responsible for the circumstances in which he finds himself. As the readings clearly stated, he is not the innocent victim of his environment, he is simply meeting self. Every incarnation represents an opportunity for growth, learning, and the resolution of soul-level patterns that may have been developing across multiple lifetimes. The readings emphasized, "What ye sow, ye reap." There are often experiences in which individuals apparently reap that which they have not sown. But this is only the short self-vision of the entity, or the one analyzing and studying purposes or ideals in relationship to those particular individuals. This principle of cause and effect operates not just within single lifetimes, but across the soul's entire journey through multiple incarnations. Cause and effect to many are the same as karma. Karma is that brought over, while cause and effect may exist in the one material experience only. This distinction was crucial in Cayce's understanding. Karma represents patterns that transcend individual lifetimes, while simple cause and effect might be resolved within a single incarnation. What emerged from thousands of readings was a clear picture of how souls progress through what Cayce called cycles of learning. These cycles could span multiple lifetimes and often involved the same groups of souls incarnating together repeatedly until mutual lessons were learned and patterns were resolved. The readings revealed that souls don't incarnate randomly, but are drawn together by karmic patterns that need to be worked out through their relationships and shared experiences. The concept of karmic completion represented something profound in Cayce's cosmology. It wasn't simply about finishing individual lessons, but about reaching a point where the soul had genuinely integrated its experiences and was ready to move to higher levels of service and consciousness. Most individuals in the present misinterpret karmic influences. Each soul, each entity should gain the proper concept of destiny. Destiny is within, or is as of faith, or is as the gift of the creative forces. Karmic influence is, then, rebellious influence against such. This understanding revolutionized how spiritual development was viewed. Rather than seeing karma as an endless cycle of debt and payment, Cayce's readings presented it as an educational system designed to help souls evolve toward reunion with their creator. The goal wasn't perfection in human terms, but the development of spiritual qualities like compassion, wisdom, and unconditional love that would prepare the soul for higher realms of existence. The first major sign of karmic completion that appeared consistently across hundreds of readings was what Cayce called the reversal of attraction. Individuals nearing the end of major karmic cycles would find themselves naturally losing interest in situations, relationships, or behaviors that had previously consumed them. This wasn't achieved through force or willpower, but through a gentle, almost effortless shift in what drew their attention and energy. One of the most documented cases involved a businessman from New York who came to Cayce in 1938. For 20 years, this man had been driven by an almost compulsive need to accumulate wealth and status. His reading revealed that this pattern stemmed from lifetimes of experiencing powerlessness and poverty. But Cayce told him something unexpected. The soul is completing its lessons around material security. You will find yourself naturally drawn towards service rather than acquisition. Within 6 months, the man reported a complete shift in his priorities, not through struggle or guilt, but through a natural evolution of his interests. He eventually established a foundation that helped struggling families during the Great Depression. This wasn't willful self-improvement. It was karmic completion expressing itself through transformed desires. The man's correspondence with the ARE over the following decade showed that this shift was permanent and brought him far greater satisfaction than his previous pursuits ever had. The second indicator Cayce identified was effortless mastery of former struggles. People approaching karmic completion would suddenly find themselves handling with ease situations that had previously caused them tremendous difficulty. Old patterns of anger, fear, or reactivity would simply dissolve without conscious effort or therapeutic intervention. In one remarkable reading from 1941, documented in the ARE files, Cayce worked with a woman who had struggled with intense jealousy throughout her marriage. Her reading revealed that this pattern connected to several lifetimes where she had experienced betrayal and abandonment. But as her karmic cycle neared completion, she found herself naturally trusting and secure in ways that surprised even her closest friends. The jealousy hadn't been suppressed through counseling or willpower. It had been transcended through the completion of the soul's learning process. Her husband later wrote to the ARE describing the transformation as miraculous, but noted that it happened gradually over about 18 months. The woman herself reported that the old triggers simply stopped affecting her. Situations that would have previously sent her into jealous rages became opportunities for compassion and understanding. This wasn't conscious behavior modification. It was the natural result of the soul having learned its lessons about trust and self-worth. What made Cayce's understanding so advanced for his time was his recognition that true karmic completion isn't about perfection or never facing challenges again. Instead, it's about meeting those same challenges from a completely different level of consciousness. The tests remain, but the soul's response reveals the depth of its growth and integration. The third sign was perhaps the most profound: the emergence of natural compassion. Cayce observed that as people completed major karmic cycles, they would develop an almost supernatural ability to understand and forgive those who had hurt them. This wasn't forced forgiveness or spiritual bypassing. It was genuine understanding that arose from seeing the larger patterns at work in human relationships. During one documented session in 1943, Cayce worked with a father whose son had been killed in the war. The man came seeking comfort, but found something far deeper. Cayce revealed that this soul contract had been agreed upon before incarnation as part of both souls' evolutionary journey. The reading explained that the son's sacrifice was serving not only his own spiritual development, but also catalyzing profound growth in his father and others touched by his life. As the father integrated this understanding over the following months, he reported not just peace but actual gratitude for his son's sacrifice and the spiritual growth it had catalyzed for both of them. His correspondence with the ARE over the following years showed that this wasn't just grief processing. It was a fundamental shift in how he understood suffering, purpose, and the interconnectedness of all souls. He eventually became a counselor for other grieving parents, using his own transformation to help others find meaning in their losses. This level of compassion, Cayce explained, only emerges when a soul has truly learned the lessons embedded in its karmic patterns. It's not something that can be forced or faked through positive thinking or spiritual practices. It arises naturally as understanding deepens, and the soul recognizes the perfect justice and love operating through even the most difficult circumstances. But what researchers found most intriguing about Cayce's karmic teachings was his insistence that completion of major cycles always involves what he called the service revelation. As souls near the end of significant karmic patterns, they invariably discover a unique form of service that feels completely natural and energizing rather than dutiful or draining. In reading after reading, Cayce described people suddenly recognizing their true purpose, not as a career or role, but as a specific way of contributing to human consciousness evolution. This revelation typically came not through meditation or seeking, but through the natural unfolding of the soul's completed understanding. A documented case involved a school teacher from Kentucky who came to Cayce in 1939, feeling lost and purposeless despite decades of dedication to education. Her reading revealed that her soul was completing major cycles around wisdom sharing and was ready to step into a more expansive form of teaching. The reading stated, "The entity has gained much in its understanding of how to reach the minds and hearts of others. Now comes the time for the broader application of these abilities." Within a year, she had developed innovative educational methods that later influenced progressive education movements across the country. But what was remarkable was how effortless this transition felt to her. She later wrote to the ARE that the new teaching methods seemed to flow through her, rather than from her conscious planning. The service emerged naturally from her karmic completion, bringing her a sense of fulfillment she had never experienced in conventional teaching. The fourth sign Cayce consistently identified was spontaneous healing of chronic patterns. This might manifest as sudden recovery from long-standing physical conditions, the natural resolution of repetitive relationship dynamics, or the effortless breaking of addictive behaviors that had persisted for years. What made this different from typical healing was its permanence and ease. People weren't wrestling with symptoms or working hard to maintain changes. Instead, the patterns simply dissolved as the underlying karmic lessons reached completion. One of the most documented cases in the ARE files involved a woman from Virginia who had suffered from chronic anxiety for over 2 decades. Multiple doctors had been unable to help her, and conventional treatments provided only temporary relief. Cayce's reading revealed that her anxiety stemmed from traumatic deaths in several past lives where she had been unable to protect loved ones. The reading stated, "The soul has carried the memory of these experiences as a constant vigilance against loss, but this vigilance has become a prison rather than protection." As she integrated this understanding and completed the associated karmic pattern through working with families who had lost children, her anxiety disappeared completely. Follow-up correspondence in the archives shows she remained anxiety-free for the rest of her life, spanning over 30 years. More significantly, she became a grief counselor, whose own experience of fear transformation allowed her to help others heal their deepest wounds. Her anxiety hadn't just been cured, it had been transformed into a gift for others. The fifth indicator was what Cayce called effortless boundary setting. People completing major karmic cycles would find themselves naturally saying no to draining relationships or situations without guilt or conflict. They would attract more authentic connections and opportunities, while gracefully releasing what no longer served their soul's evolution. This wasn't about becoming selfish or uncaring. Instead, it reflected a deep understanding of what truly supports spiritual growth versus what merely fulfills ego needs or karmic obligations. The boundaries emerged from wisdom rather than fear or anger, creating space for more meaningful relationships and service. A documented case involved a minister from North Carolina who came to Cayce in 1940, exhausted from years of overgiving to his congregation while neglecting his own family and health. His reading revealed that his compulsive helping pattern stemmed from past lives where he had failed to serve others in their time of need. The reading explained, "The entity seeks to balance previous experiences of withholding aid, but has swung to the opposite extreme of depletion. But as this karmic cycle reached completion, he found himself naturally balancing service with self-care. His ministry became more effective, not less, as he learned to serve from fullness rather than depletion. His congregation actually grew stronger as they learned to support each other rather than depending entirely on his energy. The boundaries he set weren't perceived as rejection, but as invitations for others to step into their own spiritual power." The sixth sign Cayce identified was the integration of opposites. Souls nearing karmic completion would naturally embody qualities that had previously seemed contradictory. They might become both more discerning and more accepting, more independent and more connected, more peaceful and more passionate about justice. This integration reflected the soul's mastery of the dualistic lessons that had been playing out through multiple lifetimes. Instead of swinging between extremes, these individuals found a dynamic balance that honored both sides of life's polarities. They could be simultaneously firm and gentle, serious and playful, engaged and detached as circumstances required. One documented case involved a woman whose readings revealed she had spent many lifetimes alternating between extremes of material indulgence and spiritual asceticism. In some lives she had been wealthy but spiritually empty. In others she had been devoutly religious but impoverished and judgmental. Her current incarnation was designed to integrate these opposing approaches to life. As her karmic pattern reached completion, she found herself able to enjoy material beauty and comfort without attachment, and to pursue spiritual development without rejecting the physical world. She became both a successful businesswoman and a spiritual teacher, demonstrating that prosperity and spirituality could enhance rather than contradict each other. Her life became a living example of the integration her soul had achieved. But perhaps the most remarkable sign Cayce described was the seventh, recognition of the eternal self. People completing major karmic cycles would begin to experience themselves as consciousness that temporarily inhabits physical form rather than as physical beings seeking spiritual experiences. This shift in identity wasn't philosophical, but experiential, a lived knowing of their eternal nature. This recognition typically brought profound peace and fearlessness, not because life's challenges disappeared, but because they were understood within the context of the soul's eternal journey. Death, loss, and change became transitions rather than tragedies. The individual maintained full engagement with life while holding a deeper perspective that transcended temporary circumstances. A documented case involved a man whose reading revealed he had completed major cycles of learning about power and service. As he integrated this completion, he reported a fundamental shift in how he experienced himself and reality. Physical pain still hurt. Emotional losses still brought grief, but underneath these surface experiences was an unshakable knowing of his eternal nature and purpose. He described it as watching a movie while simultaneously being aware of sitting in the theater. The movie remained engaging and meaningful, but he never forgot it was a temporary experience. This perspective allowed him to participate fully in life while maintaining the kind of detachment that the spiritual traditions call liberation or enlightenment. What made Cayce's approach so revolutionary was his insistence that these signs couldn't be forced or imitated. Karmic completion happens in its own timing, as the soul genuinely integrates the lessons embedded in its experiences. Attempting to rush the process or fake the signs actually delays authentic completion by reinforcing the ego's tendency to seek spiritual advancement for personal aggrandizement. However, Cayce did offer guidance for supporting natural karmic completion. He consistently recommended meditation, not as spiritual practice but as a way of listening for the soul's authentic promptings. The readings emphasized, mind is the builder, and if there will be kept a balance, let the physical mind and the spiritual mind should cooperate, coordinate. He emphasized the importance of responding to life from love rather than fear, knowing that love-based choices accelerate karmic resolution, while fear-based choices create additional patterns to unravel. For each soul meets constantly itself, not alone in what is called at times karma or karmic influences. For remember, life is God. That which is constructive grows, that which is destructive deteriorates. Cayce also stressed the significance of forgiveness, not as a moral requirement, but as practical wisdom. Learn this lesson well, the spiritual truth. Criticize not unless you wish to be criticized, for with what measure ye meet it is measured to thee again. It may not be in the same way, but ye cannot even think bad of another without it affecting thee in a manner of destructive nature. Holding resentment, he explained, keeps souls bound to the very patterns they're trying to complete. Forgiveness liberates both the forgiver and the forgiven to move forward in their spiritual evolution. But this forgiveness must be genuine, arising from understanding rather than mere intellectual decision. For those recognizing these signs in their own lives, Cayce offered both congratulation and caution. Karmic completion, he warned, often brings temporary disorientation as the soul adjusts to new levels of consciousness. Old certainties may crumble before new understanding stabilizes. This transition period requires patience and trust in the process. He also emphasized that completing one set of karmic cycles doesn't mean the end of spiritual growth. Instead, it represents graduation to more advanced levels of soul development. The challenges don't disappear. They become more subtle and sophisticated as consciousness evolves. For each soul enters that it may make its path straight. They alone who walk the straight and narrow way may know themselves to be themselves, and yet one with the creative forces. Modern researchers studying consciousness transformation have found striking parallels to Cayce's observations. What he described as karmic completion aligns closely with what contemporary psychology calls post-conventional development, stages of human growth that transcend typical adult patterns and move toward what some call integral or transpersonal consciousness. But Cayce's contribution went beyond psychological theory. He provided a practical framework for recognizing and supporting these natural evolutionary processes rooted in direct psychic perception of individual souls' journeys across multiple lifetimes. His readings offer hope that no matter how stuck or repetitive our patterns might seem, Completion and transformation are always possible. The thousands of documented cases in the Virginia Beach Archives represent more than historical curiosity. They provide evidence that consciousness evolution follows recognizable patterns, and that what we call karma isn't punishment, but education, the soul's sophisticated system for learning and growing across multiple lifetimes. What emerges from studying these cases is a picture of existence far more purposeful and hope-filled than random suffering and meaningless struggle. Each challenge becomes an opportunity for growth, each relationship a chance for mutual healing, each lifetime a step toward greater wisdom and compassion. The readings consistently emphasized that we are not victims of cosmic forces beyond our control, but active participants in our own evolution. We and we alone are responsible for what we are and our condition in this earth. Yet this responsibility comes with the promise that every sincere effort toward growth and service is supported by infinite love and wisdom. As the reading stated, each entity, each soul, enters the material experience for purposes. These are not individual or of a selfish nature, though they are very personal in their application and their practice. Each soul meets constantly itself, not alone in what is called at times karma or karmic influences. For those walking this path of recognition, Cayce's final counsel was simple. Trust the process. Your soul knows exactly what it's doing, even when your mind feels confused or overwhelmed. The signs of karmic completion aren't achievements to be earned, but natural flowering that occurs when the time is right. The evidence suggests that humanity itself may be approaching a collective completion of certain karmic cycles. Many of the patterns Cayce described in individual readings are now manifesting on a global scale, suggesting that entire groups of souls are ready to graduate to new levels of consciousness and service. If you've recognized these patterns in your own life, you're witnessing something profound, the completion of lessons your soul has been learning across lifetimes. This recognition itself is a gift, an indication that your consciousness is ready to embrace new levels of growth and service. The journey continues, but at a higher octave with greater wisdom, deeper compassion and more authentic expression of who you truly are. As Cayce often reminded those in his readings, you are not a human being having a spiritual experience. You are a spiritual being having a human experience, and that experience is leading you home to yourself. What signs of karmic completion might you be recognizing in your own life right now? The answer could change everything about how you understand your spiritual journey and your purpose in this remarkable time of human evolution.